I came home from a 12-day work trip to find my husband laughing. Not just smiling. Laughing. The kind of laugh I hadn't heard from him in months. Head thrown back, shoulders shaking, a full glass of red wine in his hand. The kitchen smelled like garlic and roasted chicken. Someone had lit the candles on the dining table. My dining table. And sitting around it were his brother, his brother's wife, and their 3 kids, all of them digging into a meal that could have fed a small restaurant. I stood in the doorway of my own house with my suitcase still in my hand and my coat half off, just staring. I said, "Where's Mizzy?" The laughing stopped. My husband, I'll call him my husband because that's what he still was that night, looked at me the way you look at someone who just showed up uninvited to a party, a flicker of something. Not guilt, just inconvenience. He said, "She's fine. She's upstairs." I dropped my bag and went upstairs. Maisie was 7 years old. She was sitting on the floor of her bedroom in the dark, still in the same clothes she'd worn to school that morning. I could tell because she had a small paint stain on her left sleeve from art class, and I remembered kissing that sleeve before I left for the airport 12 days ago. She had her stuffed rabbit in her lap and she was just sitting there, not playing, not reading, just sitting. When she saw me, she didn't run over. She looked up and her chin started doing that thing it does right before she cries, and then she said, "Mommy, I was waiting for you." I sat down on the floor next to her and I held her, and I didn't say anything for a long time. She hadn't eaten dinner. She'd been up there since 6 o'clock. It was 9:15. I need to back up. My name is not important. What is important is that I'm a 31-year-old woman who spent the better part of a decade building a career as a logistics coordinator for a mid-size import company based in Toronto. I travel, not constantly, but regularly, maybe 8 to 10 days a month on average. Sometimes more, like this last stretch, when we had a supplier issue in Vancouver that turned into something that needed 12 days of my actual physical presence on site. I have always felt guilty about the travel. That's something nobody tells you before you have a kid, that the guilt doesn't go away, it just changes shape depending on the day. Some days it's manageable. Some days it feels like swallowing gravel. My husband, I'll call him Marcus, though that's not his name, had been working freelance since he left his corporate job 2 years before. Graphic design. He worked from home. When we had Maisie, the arrangement seemed almost perfect on paper. I brought in the stable income, the benefits, the extended health, the dental. He managed his freelance clients on his own schedule and was home with Maisie when I wasn't. We had a nanny for overlap hours, a woman named Mrs. Huang who Maisie loved, who picked her up from school 3 days a week. It had worked fine. For a while. What I didn't know, what I was about to spend the next 4 months slowly uncovering, was that things had stopped working fine sometime around the previous spring, and nobody had told me. His brother's name is Kyle. Kyle and his wife have 3 kids under 10. They live in Hamilton, about an hour from us. Kyle had always been fine. Not someone I'd call a close friend, but perfectly decent, the kind of family member you can spend a holiday weekend with without incident. His wife is a different story. I'll call her Dana. Dana had never liked me. I knew this from the beginning, in the way you know certain things without anyone ever confirming them. Something in how she looked at me at family dinners, something in the way she redirected conversation whenever I was speaking. My mother-in-law had let it slip once years ago that Dana thought I worked too much and that Marcus deserved someone more present. She'd said it like she was passing along neutral information. She wasn't. I'd chosen, for the sake of keeping peace, to keep a polite distance. Professional courtesy, but nothing warmer. After I found Maisie upstairs, I came back down. I stood in the kitchen doorway and I said, very calmly, "I'd like everyone to go home now." Marcus got up from the table. He had that look on his face, the one I'd started to recognize, the one that meant he was about to explain to me why I was wrong to feel whatever I was feeling. He said, "They just got here a couple of hours ago. Kyle drove from Hamilton." I said, "That's not my problem. My daughter has been sitting alone in the dark for 3 hours, and she hasn't eaten dinner." Dana said something under her breath. I didn't ask her to repeat it. I went back upstairs and I made Maisie a bowl of cereal, because it was the fastest thing I could do, and I sat with her while she ate it, and I read her 2 chapters of her book, and I put her to bed. When I came back downstairs, they were still there. They left around 11. Kyle shook Marcus's hand on the way out. Dana didn't look at me. When the door closed, Marcus said, "You embarrassed me." I said, "Where's Mrs. Huang?" He said, "I let her go for the week. I was here. I didn't need her." I said, "So who was watching Maisie while you were down here with Kyle and Dana?" He said she was fine. He said that a lot. She's fine. Everything is fine. I was overreacting. I was always overreacting. I didn't argue. I was too tired, and something in my stomach had gone very still and very quiet, the way it goes right before I make a decision I won't take back. I went to bed. I lay there for 2 hours without sleeping. In the morning, I called my best friend. Her name is Robin. She's been my best friend since our second year at Ryerson, and she's also, conveniently, a paralegal at a family law firm downtown. I called her at 7:30 in the morning and I said, I need to ask you something and I need you to be honest. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, what happened? I told her what I'd come home to. I told her about Maisie in the dark. I told her about the candles and the wine and the roasted chicken. Robin said, okay, I need to ask you something first. How are the finances? Do you have full visibility on all your accounts? I said yes, of course. We had a joint account for household expenses and separate personal accounts. I had access to everything, she said. Can you log in right now and look at the joint account and tell me what you see? I pulled up the app. The joint account had a balance of just under $400. I sat very still. Our regular balance on that account ran between $8,000 and $12,000. Marcus transferred his freelance income in monthly. I transferred a portion of my paycheck bi-weekly. $400 meant something had happened that hadn't been there the last time I checked, which was before I left for Vancouver. I said, Robin. She said, I know. Don't say anything to him yet. Can you pull your transaction history? I pulled the transaction history. There were 41 withdrawals over the past 2 months. Transfers, not to any account I recognized. Small ones, 200 here, 500 there, a few at 1,000. But when I added them up in my head, running the numbers 3 times because my hands were shaking, the total came to just over $38,000. I said, 38,000. Robin said, okay. Don't touch anything. Come to the office this morning. I want to say that I confronted him immediately. I want to say I walked downstairs and looked him in the eye and demanded answers. That's not what happened. What happened was I sat on the edge of the bed for 20 minutes, breathing, and then I got Maisie dressed and fed and walked her to school. And I said good morning to Marcus like nothing was wrong, and I drove downtown to Robin's office. I sat across from her and her colleague, a family law lawyer named Sandra who I'd never met before, and I laid out everything I knew. The account, the withdrawals, Maisie alone upstairs, Mrs. Huang being let go without my knowledge. Sandra listened to all of it and then she said, before we talk about next steps, I need to ask you something directly. Is there anything else you've noticed recently that concerned you? Changes in his behavior, unexplained absences, new people in his life? I said no. And then I stopped. I said, his brother has been coming around more, Kyle and his wife, more than usual. Sandra wrote something down. She said, and the wife, Dana, do they have a close relationship with your husband? I said, Marcus and Dana have always gotten along well. She preferred him over me, I always knew that. Sandra looked at Robin, then she looked back at me. She said, I'm not saying anything definitive right now, but I want you to start paying attention. She gave me 2 pieces of advice. First, don't confront Marcus or Dana until we know more. Second, if you can, get access to any shared devices or documents he might not have thought to lock. I followed both of those pieces of advice exactly. That's the part of the story that makes me different from the women I've read about online, the ones in the comment sections who everyone yells at for not listening to their lawyers. I listened. It was the smartest thing I ever did. I spent the next 3 weeks being very calm and very present and very normal at home. I made dinners. I picked Maisie up from school twice a week. I laughed at Marcus's jokes. I transferred my usual portion of my paycheck into the joint account, and I watched what happened to it. Within 9 days, $6,000 had moved out again. Same pattern, same type of transfers. I mentioned to Marcus casually over dinner one evening that I'd noticed the balance was low. I said I thought maybe we should put a monthly review on the calendar, just to make sure we were on track for Maisie's RESESP contributions. He barely looked up from his phone. He said, yeah, definitely. Good idea. He never brought it up again. I went back to Sandra. I brought her screenshots of every transaction. I also brought her something I'd found by accident, or maybe not entirely by accident. I'd been looking for a printer cable in Marcus's office and I'd found a folder in the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside was a printed email chain. I didn't take it. I photographed every page with my phone. When I put those photos on Sandra's desk, she went through them slowly without saying anything. Then she said, I'm going to refer this to someone in our financial investigations unit. I'm also going to recommend you open a personal account at a different bank and start directing your paycheck there going forward. Today. I did that on my lunch break. The email chain, as Sandra later explained to me, showed a series of conversations between Marcus and Dana, using a personal email address I didn't have access to, on an account I hadn't known existed, about money, specifically, about a reno project at Kyle and Dana's house in Hamilton. A project Marcus had apparently been helping to fund using our joint account. There was no reno project as far as any of the contractors Sandra's investigator later contacted could confirm. There was, however, a very nice new finished basement, and a backyard deck, and a kitchen remodel, all of which Kyle and Dana had completed in the past 18 months. I want to tell you about the morning Maisie told me she didn't like when Auntie Dana stayed over. I almost dropped my coffee, I said, very carefully. When did Auntie Dana stay over, sweetheart? She said. When you were in Vancouver. She slept in your room. I put the mug down on the counter. I sat down next to Maisie at the kitchen table and I said, how many nights? She held up 3 fingers, then she put one down, then she held up 3 again. I said, more than 3 nights. She said, I don't know. Lots. She used your shampoo and it smelled wrong. I excused myself and I went to the bathroom and I stood over the sink with the tap running and I just breathed. When I was ready, I came back out. I made Maisie her toast. I kissed her head. I texted Sandra under the table. Sandra responded within an hour. She said, don't engage. Don't let on. I know this is hard. We're close. I had never in my life wanted to do something and been told not to as many times as I was told not to during those weeks. But I didn't. I held on. 2 things happened in the same week in November. The first thing, Sandra called me on a Tuesday afternoon and told me she'd filed for divorce on my behalf, and that Marcus had been served that morning at home. She also told me that the financial documentation we'd compiled, the transfers, the email chain, the contractor records, the evidence that money from our joint account had been funneled into Kyle and Dana's home renovation, had been referred to a forensic accountant and was being reviewed for potential fraud charges. The second thing, Dana showed up at my office. I don't know how she found out where I worked. My office address isn't listed anywhere associated with my personal name, but she showed up at reception and asked for me, and the receptionist, not knowing any better, buzzed me. I did not go down to meet her. I texted Sandra immediately. Sandra texted back, good, do not speak with her. If she refuses to leave, have security escort her out. Document everything. I had security escort Dana out of my building. The whole thing was on camera. Sandra got a copy. 2 days later, Dana sent me a text from a number I didn't recognize. It said that I was destroying their family. It said I didn't deserve Marcus. It said some other things that I won't repeat because they're not worth the space. I forwarded the text to Sandra without responding. Sandra said, good girl. The divorce proceeding was not fast. I'm not going to pretend it was fast, because that's the part that nobody tells you in the stories you read online. The part where it's 6 months of paperwork and waiting and your lawyer calling with updates and you trying to go to work every day and make dinner every night and read bedtime stories like your entire life isn't quietly being restructured in a downtown law office. Marcus moved out in December. He went to Kyle and Dana's, which surprised no one. For the first 3 weeks after he left, Maisie asked for him every night at bedtime. I told her that Daddy was going through some grown-up stuff but that he loved her and that hadn't changed. I said it every time because it was true, and because she needed it to be true, even if the rest of it wasn't. By January, she'd stopped asking every night. By February, she'd started sleeping through again. The financial investigation concluded the following spring. Marcus was ordered to repay his portion of the fraudulent transfers. Sandra's forensic accountant had traced $38,460 from our joint account to Kyle and Dana's property renovations. Kyle and Dana were separately named in a civil suit that we filed in conjunction. Marcus, to avoid a longer proceeding, settled. He signed over his share of the equity in our house. He waived any claim to spousal support. He paid Sandra's fees. The morning Sandra called to tell me it was over, I was sitting in the kitchen with Maisie, who was eating her oatmeal and telling me about a dream she'd had where our cat was a librarian. I laughed for the first time in months. A real laugh, the kind that surprises you a little. Maisie looked at me and said, "What's funny?" I said, "You." She grinned and went back to her oatmeal. I stayed in the house. Sandra had said at the start that in Ontario, and in our specific circumstances, I had a strong claim to the matrimonial home, especially given that I was Maisie's primary caregiver during Marcus's freelance years, and especially given the financial misconduct. She was right. The house stayed mine. I changed the locks the week Marcus left. I repainted the bedroom. I bought new sheets and a new bath mat, and I replaced the shampoo. Maisie helped me pick the paint color. She chose a very specific shade of green that she called the inside of a pear. It's on our bedroom wall right now. I also called Mrs. Huang and asked if she'd come back. She said yes without hesitating. And she showed up the following Monday with a tin of almond cookies for Maisie, which I consider one of the kindest things anyone did for us that whole year. I think about the night I came home sometimes. The candles, the wine, the laughing. Maisie upstairs in the dark. I think about how I stood in the doorway of my own kitchen and felt like a guest. I think about Robin asking me to pull up the bank app at 7:30 in the morning, and the number I saw, and how my hands shook. I think about Sandra saying don't engage, don't engage, don't engage, and how many times I had to repeat it to myself like a kind of prayer. I think about Maisie holding up her fingers. 3, then more than 3. Here's what I know now that I didn't know then. The hardest part of protecting yourself is the waiting. It's the part where you have to know something is wrong and not react yet. Because reacting before you're ready hands the other person an advantage they don't deserve. Every instinct you have tells you to say something, do something, throw the wine glass against the wall, and you can't. You just have to keep making dinners and laughing at jokes and waiting until the pieces are all in place. It's the hardest thing I've ever done. Including the 12-day trip to Vancouver, including the first 3 weeks after Marcus left, including all of it. But Maisie started sleeping through the night. The basement got repainted pear green. Mrs. Huang came back with cookies, and I have not once, not for a single morning since, woken up to find someone else's shampoo in my bathroom. That's enough. That's more than enough.